HPE announced their earnings, and they announced the first exascale computer alongside with AMD technology. Wow. So Daniel, why don't you dive into this one?
Yeah, I'll start on the earnings, and then you can finish me off, and then we'll talk a little bit about the supercomputer. So the earnings were okay. I mean, this is one of these weird periods of time where we know there's some contraction, there's some economic headwinds, supply chain issues linger, interest, you got currency exchange issues, you got, China shutdowns, you've got war. There's all kinds of factors. And so we have definitely seen some companies outperform handedly. We've seen some companies struggle. And this has become a bit more mixed. On the recent All-In Pod, Chamath talks about alpha and beta. And it's interesting about how some companies have been able to grow endlessly during the pandemic because beta was high. And then alpha is really being able to function in any economic scenario. And that's less about HPE, but more about we're starting to see this decoupling of companies that are exploding and growing, even though it seems tougher, and companies that are finding more headwinds. I really like what HPE is doing with the GreenLake business. And so when I'm kind of assessing the earnings, I spend a lot of my effort there. You really have to look at HPE as a sort of a startup within a big, kind of monolithic tech company. Because what Antonio Neri's been focused on since 2018-19 has been GreenLake, has been subscription, has been as a service. And so when you start to make that pivot, and we've seen it with companies that go from prem to cloud, like Microsoft, when that pivot gets made, there's always going to be this interim period of time where revenue growth is going to potentially slow because you go from large CapEx deals to smaller cash flow OpEx deals. And so I'm looking at HPE and I'm looking at GreenLake and I'm saying, look, I think you're going to see some resistance to growth. And part of it is because they got to execute and perform better. Part of it, though, is because they actually, on their GreenLake business, are executing and performing quite well. 100% plus growth in their as a service business again. So congratulations to them on that, and Keith White and the team on that accomplishment. But in some areas like storage, where we did see Dell, for instance, have a really big quarter, we saw HPE being down. And so, I think there's got to be an answer to that. I think, the market needs to say, hey, what's going on here? Is it falling off, or is it because more deals are going to as a service? What is the, divergence of those sales? Or, Pat, you mentioned HPC being off a little bit there. What happened there? And so that's one of the questions I'm looking for from HPE. Now, on a more positive note, the company has continued to execute very well at the edge. That intelligent edge business that rolled out has continued to perform well, has seen, close to double-digit growth. And so, as a whole, as I sort of weigh the outlook on the company, I think you've got to kind of balance those two things. You've got to balance the sort of traditional legacy, large OpEx or CapEx IT business, and then you've got to look at the GreenLake business. If you're looking at that traditional business, I think it's going to be a harder road ahead, but I think the company already identified that. That's why they pivoted. That's why they're transforming the business and putting all their eggs into the GreenLake area. And so if GreenLake is growing strong, I think the long-term trajectory for the company looks pretty good, but that is the number to watch. If that number starts falling off, then we really have to start to worry about what the long-term looks like.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw, by the way, I agree with everything you just said. I think this quarter was primarily about supply chain. Every single segment, if you look, sorry, I'm sure you looked at the slides, but in the slides, supply chain was placed in every single one of those. So I think, there's some companies that seem to be managing their supply chain pretty tightly. Some industrial companies didn't bring it up once in their earnings.
And how do you account for that? I mean, I'm sincere. That's really hard because if you're like an outsider, you've been inside the walls of company, like when you were at AMD, and you've listened to this and watched this and you understand this. But what I'm saying is, you're an investor and you're saying, well, how does one company in the exact same space, Pat, say nothing and grow, and another company sitting there? And there's been a couple now that have come out. And sorry, I had to jump, but I want your take on this.
Yeah.
And they say that it's all the problem, and you're looking and you're going, well, how does one company do so much better than the other?
Yeah, so all things equal, the larger the supply chain, the more you buy, the bigger deals. Sorry, the lower prices you can get, and the more power you have over the supply chain. I don't know all of these companies' individual strategies. So, for instance, you can lock in supply 9 months from now if you're willing to pay for it and if you're willing to roll the dice. So, part of this is an educated gamble in some cases. Companies like Apple will invest billions of dollars into their suppliers to make sure that they can get supply of things like chips. They lock in that capacity and sometimes years in advance. So I'd have to do a paid research project to answer that completely. No, I know, but some of these companies are just smaller, right? When it looks at, I mean, an order of magnitude smaller in the amount of commodities that they buy. And I think in this case, I think it has a lot to do with it. So HP is buying a ton of stuff. They just seem to have a different strategy on that. The only adders on the earnings. I mean, there were some. Another reason why I think this is a big supply chain is they have record backlogs. Okay,
Yeah.
in storage, record backlog. In compute, ASP was up 20%. And what does that mean? Okay, I can't get supply, but so I'm going to shift mix to a higher ASP configuration. Orders were up 20%, right? One thing, one net adder here is that Russia did impact them. $105 million looks like a restructuring charge. No idea if that's going to be a continued charge or a one-time charge. But yeah, it's interesting. One thing I'm going to be looking at the future is, HPC had actually lost money, and the description given in the slides were really about backlog of awarded contracts. They missed delayed acceptances. Okay, and that's code for either I showed up late or I couldn't get this thing. I couldn't get this thing working. So they say they've got $3 billion in backlog, Daniel, for this HPC group. So we'll see. But hey, let's move. Let's talk about. I think, quite frankly, a whole lot more exciting than HPE earnings, and that is that HPE delivered the first exascale supercomputer on the planet called Frontier. The core technology inside of this was obviously all the goodness of Cray and the benefit that they bring from a compute standpoint. CPU and GPU was delivered by good old AMD, who, by the way, on the GPU side, really hasn't made an indelible mark in the enterprise, anything near what, let's say, NVIDIA has done. One thing I loved were some of the claims that HPE made. It said it's faster than the next 7 most powerful supercomputers in the world combined. I love stuff like that, Daniel. The other thing is the balance of power shifted from Japan, I think it was called Fugaka, a supercomputer, to Frontier here in the USA. So USA, we've got to feel pretty good, pretty good about that. So great stuff going on. I think this is front and center Cray acquisition that HPE made, which I think we're starting to see the fruits of the labor, and we'll see how high they could drive the profit in the next few quarters based on that $3 billion backlog.
Yeah, absolutely. That supercomputer is pretty special. It's changing the world kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
You can't really gloss over that. And sometimes it's easy to, because you don't realize how important these kinds of breakthroughs